Welcome to another episode of Frankly Fukuyama. I'm really happy to be able to talk to my uh, longtime now colleague, Didi Kuo. She has just written a book on political parties and what's happened to political parties over the years. So Didi is a center fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which is part of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. She is an expert on American politics and originally came to us to run a program on American politics in comparative perspective, because Americans like to think of themselves as having the perfect democracy, and beginning a few years ago we began to realize that that might not be so, and that America might actually have something to learn from other countries. Of course, we didn't listen, so here we here we are. So in any event, Didi, you've picked a really important topic, which is the role of political parties, and your argument really begins with the fact that they've been in decline. That may not be obvious to everybody, because when you have an election, that's all you hear about is the parties. But what's the evidence for their decline and I guess the loss of faith that people have in political parties?
Thank you, Frank, first of all, for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here, and it's wonderful to have been your colleague. And I think this book's ideas were really shaped by the fact that we study democracy and democratization as a process. And we know that you need a few things to create a strong democracy, and one of them is strong political parties that can channel people's interests and represent them effectively. We know that people don't feel like parties are doing a good job of that, because for decades now, since at least the 1970s, trust in political parties has been in decline. The number one sort of fastest rising party label is that of independence. And even though many independent voters still vote with one of the parties, they are also more likely to be cynical about the political process. More and more Americans say they don't like either party, even when they identify with one of them or consistently vote for one of them. So there's clearly something parties aren't doing.
And this is not just an American phenomenon.
Not just in the United States. So the book also looks at the broader world of the advanced and long-standing democracies, places that often provided a template for what a strong party should look like. And we see that membership in formal mass membership parties in Western Europe has also been in decline. It's reached record lows in the 21st century. People are fleeing and voting for what are called challenger or anti-system parties, parties that are not just to the right or the left of the mainstream center left and right parties, but also ones that sort of say the whole system needs to be kind of tackled or dismantled.
Okay, and what is the kind of evidence about the decline of trust in parties? This is poll data mostly.
Exactly, public opinion data showing that, do you trust the parties to do what's right most of the time? Or do you trust parties to pursue the public good? There's more evidence that people are cynical about what parties' goals are. They say they just want to retain power, they just want to win elections, they are not capable of addressing public problems, or they don't care about solving the public good, they only care about special interests and economic elites. So there's a rise in kind of a sense that the system doesn't work on behalf of average citizens, and that parties are central to that problem. There's also, when people ask you, do you trust the following institutions? And they ask about like the security sector, the military and the police force, businesses, journalists, and the legislatures and the courts. Parties are always at the bottom of that list. So parties are seen as sort of self-interested organizations, which is a paradox because they're supposed to be kind of the most representative institutions that we have. They're not even formal institutions of the state. They're instead these intermediary organizations that exist to tie citizens to the state. So when that layer of representation is eroded, that layer of trust, it becomes much harder for citizens to articulate a positive vision for the state or to say that they feel connected to their governments.
Right, okay. Well, we'll return to the critical importance of parties at a later point, but let's get into some of the reasons that you argue in the book for why trust in parties has been retreating. So some of the reasons, I think, are in a way not the fault of the parties themselves, but it's just a changing environment. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how technology and demographics and all of these other things have affected the way people relate to parties.
Definitely. So in the early days of parties were, when suffrage was first being extended, parties could be very labor intensive, and they kind of needed to be. You needed ways to get out into communities of newly enfranchised voters and tell them what elections were going to look like and try to mobilize them. So parties developed highly locally with party agents, often kind of party brokers that you were using within the party, and then slowly formalized a role for what parties would look like on the ground. But again, very capital and labor intensive party organization. In an era of patronage and spoils, people who worked for the party could then get a benefit from the party, a job, for example, and they would pay back some of their wage to the party itself or have to work and volunteer in a campaign. So over the course of time, this is largely unsustainable as the population becomes very large and as parties become more programmatic, as they don't offer just material side benefits, but instead big national policy programs. The parties themselves have to adapt to changing technological advances, and by the time you get to, say, the mid-20th century, you have parties that are going to use television to talk directly to an audience, or use direct mail to reach people through the mail, rather than relying heavily on local sort of foot-stomping party soldiers.
And by the way, that's not an entirely bad transition, right?
Definitely not.
The old system was called the spoils system or the patronage system. And
exactly.
if you got a bottle of bourbon or something, you'd vote for a particular candidate.
Right.
Whereas in democratic theory, at least, you're supposed to vote on your preference for issues and policies.
That's right. So over time, you would expect parties to become more democratic as organizations, not only through the kind of mechanism by which they attract voters, i.e. not corrupt mechanisms, but also by using the government to actually foster the public good, to build a social contract with citizens, and to give citizens actual choices in elections. So you have at least two parties that compete in a democratic system that can offer different choices to voters, and in theory, elections are the mechanism by which you also then hold parties accountable to those promises. Now, the problem, or one of the issues with technological change and party adaptation, is that there are trade-offs. So when you use different kinds of communications technology, like mass communications, to talk to the electorate and communicate with them, you lose some kind of the kind of human element that local or much more labor-intensive parties had. So in the book, there's an example from Tammany Hall, which we now remember as being highly corrupt, rightfully so, but also the politics of Tammany Hall required ward bosses to be in very close touch with their citizens on the ground to understand what is it people needed and what is it that, the local party could provide. Nowadays, if you walk into your local party, it's probably empty. It exists like on paper, but probably receives very few actual resources. And in fact, Steve Bannon in 2020, when Trump was trying to win re-election for a second term, he said that if you are a MAGA person, you should go to your local Republican Party. It's probably empty. You can run for the chair of that local party, and then you'll be given the task of finding poll workers for the election. You have all sorts of power, and you have an opportunity because there's kind of there's like a vacuum at the local level for those parties. So technological change has now led to a world in which you can just, have a social media presence and connect directly to voters. There's some interesting evidence that in American politics, a lot of primary challengers are political novices, but they can build a base of support and receive donations from outside their constituency because they have an immediate connection through social media. And there's also a second type of change is not just technological, where it's just easier to reach a lot of people without a party organ. But it's also the fact that parties themselves have become professionalized. Yeah. So they've made a choice to expand their operations to win elections, and there's just many more resources devoted to the strategy game, polling, gathering data on different kinds of voters and developing profiles of them. So you can target them with messages that will appeal from one election to another. This is a super short-term strategy. That is not designed to build kind of party loyalty over time, and is certainly not designed to establish a party presence in an associational or civic way. It does work to win elections, but it also means that parties don't have the kind of loyalty you could muster back when you were a more robust organization. And it also provides a lot of expertise outside the party now that can engage in issue aggregation or voting for or kind of issue areas for certain candidates that parties used to retain in-house.
Yeah.
And once those skills leave the party, it can weaken the party. It means that now in the United States, for example, the deregulated world of campaign finance means you have non-party actors who can have significant sway in elections.
So let's talk about the finance stuff in a minute, but
Okay.
I just remember during last November's election,
Yeah,
I would probably get 25 emails a day.
exactly.
Urging me to vote
Right.
various ways. And every time I got one of these, I figured, yeah, there's an AI behind this that has somehow gotten my email address and is just spewing out this stuff. And
Right.
it didn't make me particularly feel warm towards, whoever had created this system.
Not at all. And so in the early 2000s, you had some campaigns, Bush 2004 and Obama 2008, that were pioneers at building a little bit of a digital infrastructure. And sometimes the word grassroots was used to describe this. Like Obama for America, his presidential run in 2008 used basically an amassing of people's email addresses in order to develop a new coalition for his candidacy. Now, that was an innovation, but it also is hardly actually grassroots, and we now live in a world in which the Rolodex of email addresses is probably the party's singular best resource, but it's not at all a substitute for voter engagement. So a party can certainly reach a lot of people by texting them about how dire it is and you need to donate $5 right now. But that's different from a linkage, which is an academic term to describe, an actual connection between a party, some member of a party, and a citizen on the ground.
Yeah. So let's talk about the way that parties are now financed, because that has a lot to do with the way that they've been weakened. And you can get a little bit detailed in this, because I think people don't really understand the way that our campaign finance system has evolved, or you might say broken down, over the last couple of decades.
It's been a long journey in campaign finance. So people never like the idea of money in politics, and yet elections are expensive, and we have a First Amendment in the United States, and that's going to be critical to this story. So in the 1990s, parties were seen as corrupt because they used soft money, which was kind of a pool of money within the national parties that could be used on electioneering and get out the vote efforts. But they could fundraise for soft money because there are caps on the amounts that you can donate to individual candidates. So soft money was seen as a vehicle for corruption, and famously Bill Clinton exchanged nights in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House for soft money donations. And it was seen as a tool especially of corporate access to political parties. So the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act was passed in 2000 and limited the numbers of funds that parties could raise. And as a result, more funds have to go outside the party system to different kinds of political groups.
And by the way, historically, the ability to distribute money is one of the central powers of a party, right?
Absolutely.
And when you take that away and give it to somebody else, that by itself really weakens the influence that the party has.
That's right. I guess we should clarify that we've long had, the way most political parties work is that they're responsible for candidate selection and for running election campaigns. And they do that by using the leverage that they have, including resources like money and volunteers, to pick candidates that they think are going to represent the party well, carry the party's brand, and also that will help contribute to the long-term run of the party. So parties are in theory better for democracy than any one individual, because they don't just care about individual loyalty or individual transactions, but instead care about having a party remain a permanent kind of competitive force in a country's democracy, so they can kind of transcend the needs or whims of any one individual. But for that to work, party leaders need to be able to distribute funds in ways that are strategic and to find the best candidates. And parties also have really good mechanisms of developing a bench of, say, state legislators and young candidates for office that they can then cultivate over time to become party leaders. And that's true not just in the United States, but around the world, where parties have a really big say in determining who their candidates and leaders are going to be. So in the United States, after BICRA, there was already a little bit of a decentralization or diffusion.
BICRA, the bipartisan.
Campaign Finance Reform Act.
Yeah.
A diffusion of funds that had to go outside the party. And our colleague at the law school, Pam Carland, and Sam Zakharov have a theory of kind of the hydraulics of campaign finance, that when you push down on where the money can go in one area, it crops up in another area. But this really accelerated after the 2010 ruling, Citizens United, when the Supreme Court argued that money is speech, and as a result, you cannot curtail free speech in the United States. So people can now give unlimited sums to these different kinds of entities that have cropped up. 501c4s and super PACs can they kind of operate without the same Federal Election Campaign Act limits that are placed on individuals, candidates, and parties. So they can, for example, raise unlimited funds from not necessarily anonymous donors, but donors who don't have to be listed individually. They can sort of band together into organizations that then pool their funds and donate to these super PACs and 501c4s. They can run their own campaign ads and issue ads. They're just not supposed to coordinate directly with individual campaigns. But
so this is all a lot of nonsense, right? Because they are in effect coordinating, and
they definitely de facto coordinate. And in fact, some of the best super PACs, or the ones that have been able to field very successful candidates and support them, are ones that are intimately tied to former leaders of in Congress, like Paul Ryan, Senate Majority Fund and stuff. So we also know that in early 2024, before the presidential campaigns had really gotten off the ground, the FEC issued not a new ruling, but kind of an interpretation that you could now have super PACs coordinate on get out the vote efforts with individual campaigns. So this is how President Trump ended up outsourcing a lot of his ground game to Elon Musk's America PAC. And at the time, this was seen as kind of a foolhardy move on his part, because Harris, as candidate for president, was doing a lot of the traditional GOTV efforts, get out the vote efforts, that we know are successful. So deploying tons of volunteers in swing states to go knock on doors. Whereas Elon Musk was, running contests to see if you could win money by vowing to support certain kinds of policy areas. And he is not someone who has elected experience or experience in campaigns, but he did bring lots of financial resources to bear, and apparently this was a good strategy for winning the 2024 election.
Yeah. And I suppose they're really, as long as that Citizens United decision stands, there's really not much that anybody can do about it, not much that Congress can do to re-regulate parties.
That's right. It seems like even if you could place more stringent caps, that they would maybe violate the Supreme Court's current interpretation of the First Amendment. I am by no means a constitutional law scholar, but it does seem like money in politics is here to stay for now. I will also note, though, that people who study Western Europe have a very different understanding, or there's a very different way that campaign finance works there. It's highly regulated, and the state often provides subventions to political parties or helps fund their activities. But a similar dynamic has occurred where, Katz and Mayer, Richard Katz and Peter Mayer, two famous political scientists, have argued this created a cartelization of political parties, where especially the established mainstream parties of the right and left didn't have to rely on mass membership anymore for funding and for resources. And they also have become more elite, more technocratic, and more disconnected from the electorates that they serve. So even though you can have more regulated campaign finance, that doesn't necessarily then create the kinds of linkages that citizens need to kind of trust parties or
Although it does seem to me that some other democracies have been a little bit more successful in keeping really big amounts of money out of campaigns.
Oh, absolutely.
They have, bans on TV advertising,
right.
or, you can't do stuff in the month before the election.
Exactly.
And all sorts of things.
That's right. And much shorter election periods, whereas
Yeah.
ours seem to be years long.
Years long and getting longer with every election cycle.
Exactly.
Okay, so that explains a lot of the kind of technological and social background to why parties just seem, they're not the warm, cuddly, guy that will come to your mother's funeral and, pay his respects in order to get your vote. But, these mass mailings and emails and so forth. So in your book, you also say that there's a substantive reason why people got disenchanted with political parties, and that really has to do with the economy and globalization. So maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. So this is something that seems paradoxical given the polarized era in which we live. And I've sometimes found it difficult to reconcile the fact that our parties are so different today from one another, yet this sort of period of neoliberal consensus also happened. So after the 1980s, when conservatives did well for many successive elections, not just Ronald Reagan here in the United States, but also in certain countries in Western Europe, it seemed like a real challenging time for parties of the left, social democratic parties and labor parties, after economic crises of the 1970s, and they were in the electoral wilderness. At the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, sort of two things happened. One is it was an era of, potential peace and prosperity, a real embrace of political and market liberalization, and Western institutions did a lot to try to promote that liberalization around the world. But it was also a time when the left was trying to think about its electability, and you had young leaders in factions of leftist parties like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, who thought, okay, we can actually merge these things. We can be pro-globalization and embrace a new set of economic policies that will generate growth and stability and prosperity, while also then providing a kind of policy agenda that will bring us back from the electoral wilderness. And they succeeded, by and large. And part of this success was moving towards the right on economic issues. And it's not necessarily a sheer co-optation of right policy so much as it was an adoption of similar neoliberal economic thinking across both parties.
We should probably stop and define neoliberal.
Sure. It's a thorny term to use. Here I mean it purely descriptively to refer to a set of economic orthodoxies where for economic growth to happen, states should basically get out of the way. There's a set of policies around free trade, economic integration, deregulation, the lowering of corporate taxes that will all help companies and markets excel, and a rising tide will lift all ships. So sure, globalization will entail some winners and losers in the short and the medium term, but these communities will eventually be better off. And Stephanie Mudge has called this a cross-partisan economic, sort of neoliberal economic consensus, and has documented empirically how it happened across even parties of the center left.
Yeah, well, it was hard in the 1990s, hard to find anybody that didn't like free trade.
Exactly.
And didn't think that this would be of benefit, and if there were going to be losers, you just compensate them by giving them
trade adjustment
job
policies.
training. Yeah.
Exactly. And for parties of the left, this was difficult because they had long championed poverty alleviation and workers' rights. And as they embraced free trade and deregulation, they also said, we will still adopt the language of social democracy and protect poverty, but we do need to implement some austerity around welfare policies and condition benefits on employment, for example, do a little bit more means testing of social programs. And this was at least a reconfiguration of the long-standing social contract that the left had adopted with citizens. And this over time, this kind of consensus on economics can do two things. The first is just politically, it becomes harder for voters to identify differences in the parties. So if they feel that they are, for example, aggrieved by a shift towards globalization, they kind of have both parties to blame, and no one is clearly articulating what they'll do for them. And in a lot of other places around the world where market liberalization happened against the will of the people, so in places in Latin America or Southeast Asia or any number of places, voters there often just rejected parties across the board, or often felt like they could not trust any of those parties who had implemented these types of policies. But the second issue is also that over time, and this is something that helps understand contemporary events, neither party was really articulating a vision for the state either. And it was Bill Clinton who said the era of big government is over, and a lot of times attacks on government came from both parties. The government needs to get out of the way, it slows things down, markets don't need more regulation. And the argument is more just that people hear a lot then about why government is bad and why undermining government is potentially a way to create more economic prosperity. But it can also then, it's very then unclear who's supposed to solve public problems. And Sometimes it seemed as if the private sector should develop more solutions to some of the problems that we face in our society, but the private sector is not a set of democratically accountable actors. And if you don't provide a positive justification for government, then people will lose faith in government. So it's not surprising that over time, parties of the right and left, despite the fact that they had different policies, were still, not really able to offer voters what seemed like compelling different sets of options in elections.
Probably the greatest symbol of this was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. This was the famous welfare reform that was pushed by both Bill Clinton and by Newt Gingrich and signed. I mean, it ended the Depression era aid to families with dependent children program and replaced it with just block grants to the states. But the word personal responsibility is not a traditional Democratic Party word. It's something that the Republicans have been pushing, and Bill Clinton, signed on to it as one of his signature policies.
Exactly. And I think that it's, there's not a, I'm not saying that this is, causation or something, but there's also been a lot of evidence showing that as parties have tried to de-emphasize economics or to talk about them in a different way, they've amplified cultural disagreement, or, they've amplified their disagreement on different kinds of issues. So instead of just an economic axis of politics and kind of a bread and butter issues that dominate elections, there's also going to be a lot about identity, grievance, culture, and that's a lot to disentangle, and there are a lot of different arguments that people make about why that's the case. But for example, in studies of the EU, the EU, once it actually succeeded as a project by the late 90s or so, makes a lot of decisions about macroeconomic management and trade and the general sort of flow of capital, goods, and people across borders in Europe, which means that the arena for national contestation is much smaller. And in a lot of European countries, when national parties have not been able to really differentiate themselves on these economic issues that the EU is now deciding, they have to sort of amplify their difference on cultural issues. And even to that extent, they haven't necessarily succeeded, because mainstream parties of the right and left were seen as not really responsive to voters on issues like immigration, and that provides opportunities to be outflanked by other parties.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the part of the argument that I had a little trouble with, because you're sort of suggesting that by moving to the center, a lot of the left of center parties basically fail to offer a real alternative. So to put that in American terms, they weren't offering Bernie Sanders and a more genuinely progressive alternative. But it seems to me that they were just following the voters, that Bernie Sanders, it turned out he did better than people expected in 2016. But it's not obvious to me that people were yearning for a really left-wing candidate that would really get after the corporations and raise taxes on everybody, that the voters themselves, it seemed to me, had bought into this consensus, and therefore it wasn't as if the left-wing parties had a choice in terms of, moving to the center on these issues.
I think there are two things that we need to understand. You're absolutely right. There's a little bit of a tension there. The first is the decline of sort of class politics in general has certainly been a structural change that has facilitated the decline of the left, right? We don't have a manufacturing economy anymore. We have a post-industrial economy in which the sort of working class is far less visible and easy to define. And instead, you have all these surveys of Americans, most of whom think of themselves as middle class. And if we have mainly a service sector, that's a huge and amorphous set of jobs. People working in retail and hospitality and people working in white-collar law are all considered part of the service sector. So without delineable class politics, it is harder to say you have a party of the working class. So I think there's some evidence that this kind of neoliberal agenda, or if we want to call it kind of a globalization agenda embraced by social democratic parties in the 90s, was really designed to appeal to middle classes, and we know this from Herbert Kitschalt's first Transformation of Social Democracy book in the 1990s, was designed to appeal to a new set of middle classes of kind of clerical and managerial workers who did not fit the typical profile of the working class. We certainly know since the sort of finance and tech sort of takeoffs of after the turn of the century that the rise of knowledge work has benefited highly skilled, highly educated, and small segments of people. So the agenda does appeal to some people in the left coalition, just not the members of the working class who once constituted the base of that coalition. Mm-hmm. And when evaluating trade-offs, a lot of the leaders of the left parties in the 90s said, okay, the trade unions will never not vote with us. So yeah, you don't like NAFTA, we're sorry, but also like, where are you going to go? Mm-hmm. And the Republican Party was so long defined as being the party of big business and the wealthy, it seemed unthinkable that they would ever become a party of the working class. In 2012, when Mitt Romney unsuccessfully ran for president, and the Republicans did the RNC did the autopsy of the party was considered too white, too elite, too out of touch, and too rich. Mm-hmm. But, it's at least been the case since the 90s that the Democrats have been able to court business pretty successfully, and corporate America feels comfortable in both parties. And if we look in the Trump era, businesses feel conflicted, mm-hmm. but have often supported the Democratic candidate mm-hmm. By arguing Trump may not be very reliable and consistent in his support for business. And also business has been in its own kind of, not identity crisis per se, but for a long time, business was just interested in making money. The Chambers of Commerce was very political around a very narrow economic agenda of cuts to corporate taxes and, labor market flexibility, this kind of thing. But in the era post-financial crisis, there is an increasing realization that people are not happy about capitalism, and a lot of workers feel aggrieved, even if they're not organized into a working class. Mm-hmm. And so you start to see this shift from shareholder capital to stakeholder capital. The Business Roundtable issues a new statement on the principles of a corporation in 2018. Mm-hmm. And even people like Jamie Dimon or Ray Dalio, Bill Gates for sure, after he left Microsoft, are saying capitalism can solve problems. We can be a kinder, gentler set of capitalist leaders. So they start to act in a little bit more of what we would consider a civic way. And so the adoption of environmental, social, and governance goals, a lot of sort of emphasis for racial justice after the murder of George Floyd.
Which they're now all dropping like a hot
Exactly,
potato.
That's right. So all of this has been politicized. Kevin McCarthy, when he was still Speaker of the House, said we need a different Chamber of Commerce, which would have been, even 10 years prior would have been a crazy thing to say. So the point is business is now in the hot seat, just like everybody else, and so it's not loyal to the Republican Party mm-hmm. the way that it used to be, although it was trying to feign loyalty. But it has needed a home in politics, and that home has been the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. All of which is to say, the Democrats cobbled together a tenuous coalition of highly educated, coastal mm-hmm. kind of professional workers, and also kind of people who would still identify as the working class. Yeah. And this is not just true in the United States, but around the advanced democracies, the parties of the right are increasingly drawing voters who would identify as working class or people without a college education, whereas parties of the left, increasingly their base is these highly educated professionals. Yeah. And that's a realignment that I think has yet to fully settle into the parties.
So as I was reading the book, this question occurred to me. It's kind of a variation on the what's wrong with Kansas theme. Mm. So Obamacare and universal health care was one policy issue that really did sharply distinguish the parties.
That's right.
Right. Clinton tried to push for it in his first term, and he didn't get there, but Obama finally got it over the finish line, and then the Republicans spent the next decade trying to repeal Obamacare.
Right.
If people were actually that concerned about economic issues, why wasn't there more support on the left for health care? I mean, this is this weird thing. For example, we've had all these encampments on behalf of Palestinians at major universities. When's the last time you saw a student, demanding health care?
Right.
Universal health care, which used to be kind of the classic agenda of any kind of progressive, person. I mean, the Europeans had it a century ago, so that was old news to them. It should have been one of those distinguishing issues between the parties. And if economics was actually, and to deepen the mystery, among the greatest beneficiaries of Obamacare were poor white rural Southerners who didn't have health care and now had the opportunity to get it. And nonetheless, they vote for Republican politicians that want to abolish it. How does this happen?
I'm not sure that I have great answers. I will say that consistently, American public opinion is to the left of actually both parties, usually. So empirically, people who study political behavior, which I do not, have shown that Americans want more redistribution, more regulation of corporations, better health care, more kind of robust social policy and a safety net than either of the parties provides. Mm-hmm. And they've labeled this affluence bias in policy. And it's also, weirdly, not just in the United States, but across a lot of Western advanced democracies, you see this bias towards the affluent in policy making and much less redistribution than you would imagine. This also flies a little bit in the face of economic theory, which long held that under conditions of rising inequality, the left should benefit. People should mobilize in favor of greater redistribution. So we know that in theory, especially after the great financial crisis and kind of huge economic crises, people who are disadvantaged should want more redistribution. We also know that in general, when presented with a battery of policy options, Americans want kind of lefty policy options. But we also know that in practice, Republicans and Democrats, continue not to. And I don't really know the answer except to say that this has also been an era of rising polarization in which scholars of at least affective polarization indicate that when party becomes part of your social identity, that you're likely to support whatever that party does, even if it, does not necessarily align with your policy positions. And there's a lot of kind of what they call motivated reasoning, that you're able to justify it to yourself, or you seek information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs. And there's also, not as much of a policy feedback loop as we would have expected from some big social policies. And there are good scholars of American politics who have delved into this in greater detail, but they argue that, the policy feedback mechanisms that we think were responsible for the New Deal coalition lasting well over, 60 or 70 degrees into the future, those circumstances just don't really seem to obtain today. And Republicans tried to repeal Obamacare. They ultimately weren't successful because people did nonetheless like the policy. But I think this debate was brought back into focus after 2024 because Bidenomics was in theory a set of economic policies that could help deindustrialized areas in the United States or try to bring jobs through policies that would help also with the environment. And these also didn't seem to be visible or to resonate with voters or to catch on with them. Well,
that can be a subject for a subsequent long discussion. I have a theory about that
excellent.
Really has to do with the excessive proceduralism by which progressive people push the kinds of policies that they prefer, which means that then they don't get done. I mean, I think that Biden's major, like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, all in theory should have provided lots of jobs and opportunities and popularity for the Democrats. It didn't really, because none of it actually materialized, because it's just too hard to do things in the United States. Okay, so let's conclude just talking about the 2024 election and the ways in which it shows that either the Republican or the Democratic parties were or were not powerful.
So, tricky question. First of all, I was excited in June when, after President Biden's, let's just say, poor showing in a debate with President Trump, the party acted pretty quickly, in retrospect, and decisively to make Kamala Harris the nominee. They did this without a primary process, and it was a real kind of throwback to what party politics could look like if you didn't have this internal democracy over primaries. But the RNC is the Republican Party is a very different story. Since 2016, it's undergone a slow transformation into what we would call a personalistic party, to use the language of comparative politics, meaning a party organization that just serves the needs of one individual.
Yeah, in the 2020 Republican convention, their platform committee actually said, well, we don't have a platform.
Exactly.
It's whatever Donald Trump wants.
Right. So it would be, we also know that many people who are kind of stalwart establishment members of the Republican Party left the party. They campaigned for Democratic candidates over the past 2 elections at least, and they feel politically homeless, which is all to say there's not really a good banner for the center-right right now either. So you have a Republican Party that is basically just a Trump vehicle, and one that increasingly looks nothing like the Republican Party of yore in its ideas and in its approach to our institutions and our democratic process.
So that suggests it's basically very weak. I mean, it couldn't hold the center when it was attacked, by a barbarian, coming from the outside.
Right, and that's the topic of sort of How Democracies Die by Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, that one of the core things a center-right party is responsible for doing is keeping extremists outside of mainstream politics and making sure that democracy doesn't get threatened from within by people who can rise to power through a party organization. But what's strange about that is that the personalization of the party happened so quickly. For a long time, the Republican Party looked much more like a robust party organization than the Democrats. They had long-standing ties to civic sort of associations and groups, including organized religion and evangelical groups, and sometimes like associations like the NRA. They had, and the pro-life movement, for example, they had strong leadership and set of priorities. They were very effectively whipped in the legislatures. So it is really sad to see how quickly the party can be co-opted by someone. And it also begs the question of what constitutes party strength. If the Republican Party continues to win elections, there are plenty of people who would say that makes it strong. But we know that as a sort of vehicle in and of itself for different interests or for deliberation or negotiation, it is super weak. And the sort of one test of whether or not you are a Republican now is, are you loyal to Donald Trump? And that in no way makes a party strong. But on the other side, the Democratic Party, I think, has the opportunity to be a strong party. It has resources. It has a lot of people who, in theory, support the Democratic candidates and the Democratic project. But one, it has a lot of competing factions. On the one hand, that's just what it means to be in a party. But I think right now you do see a real divide between establishment Democrats who think that we can still kind of play by the rules and rely on regular politics to contain Trump, and a set of younger or more progressive ideologically politicians who think that this calls for something else. It calls for a time to mobilize people on the left in a different way. And I think the thing that is really difficult to assess the state of the parties right now is that we live in this is really a time of a threat to democracy itself. So it's not normal democratic competition. Sure, a Democrat should focus on retaking the House in 2026, but the threat is so great and being sort of the damage is being done so quickly that it requires a much broader mobilization of pro-democracy forces in the United States. The Democratic Party has to be central to that effort, but also members of the center-right who still exist and care about American democracy. We know there are a lot. Different nonprofit groups. The entire sectors of like sort of the law and universities need to act far more collectively and decisively in calling these threats to democracy and in articulating why it is that we need to protect our fundamental values and institutions. And if we can successfully do that, then we can talk about kind of leveling the playing field so that we can get back to just the kind of party competition we are long accustomed to. Fights over issues and policies rather than fights over like, what is democracy? Is this a threat to democracy?
Okay, well, from your lips to God's ear, this is how we're going to evolve in the future. Let's hope that something like that actually happens.
Yes.
Okay, well, Didi Kuo, thank you very much. That was a really fascinating discussion. Congratulations on the great retreat. What's happened, how political parties should behave and why they don't.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone.
Very good.
Thanks.